It's my distinct pleasure right now to make an introduction of our lunchtime keynote speaker, who is someone I have known. I hesitate to say this, but I think it would be just about 45 years since we were classmates in college and co-founders of an adventurous political organization known as Harvard Radcliffe Students for McGovern. We then lost contact for, 30 years, during which time Phil Angelides pursued a remarkable public career. He became treasurer of the state of California at a critical moment in that state's financial history and built a reputation for navigating the nation's largest state and taken by itself one of the world's largest economies through a period of financial difficulty. He made an effort, and you can see from his general demeanor that he was the man for this, to take down Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor of California. And in the wake of the great financial debacles of 2007 and 2008, Phil was called upon to lead the investigation, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which was the official United States government investigation into the origin of the financial crisis. And as someone who's read that document from one end to the other, I can tell you that it is a marvel of comprehensive reporting and also of clear writing. Truly a model for openness and accountability in one of the darkest and most difficult and complicated public policy questions that any country can face. And more recently than that, I was able to draw on Phil's friendship and on his heritage as a prominent member of the Greek-American community to work with him quite closely over the last year in a variety of ways, but mostly with respect to the American political scene, in helping to explain and to ease the path faced by, under very difficult circumstances, by the government of Greece. And we most prominently and famously organized a dinner for the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, at the Cosmos Club on the occasion of the World Bank IMF meetings in April. Phil did all the organizing. I simply got the finance minister there. And as part of the extraordinarily efficient operation of Phil's staff, I received an email the night before the dinner that it was just a reminder that the Cosmos Club, which is, if you don't know it, one of the epicenters of imperial power and prestige in the United States, or at least it was when we had imperial power and prestige, had a coat and tie rule. And I went to sleep on this without thinking about it, and I woke up in the morning in a cold sweat, realizing that our guest of honor for that night does not own a tie, and what's more, did not own a shirt that could carry a tie. So in a slight panic, I called Phil, who fielded this particular infield grounder with great aplomb. Phil called Brooksley Bourne. Brooksley Bourne called the managing director of the Cosmos Club. The managing director of the Cosmos Club got us a derogation, I think that's the correct term in the European treaties, and provided that Phil and I stood outside like centurions dressed in coats and ties, we could grab the finance minister, sweep him inside past the guards, and get him to a private room where all would be secure. And that's exactly how Phil Angelides and James Galbraith broke the coat and tie rule at the Cosmos Club. And on that note, I give you with the greatest pleasure my longtime friend, Phil Angelides.
So there you have it, 43 years of political activism together, and we were able to break a coat and tie rule. Says a lot. Thank you, Jamie, very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here with all of you today. And I want to say, starting off today, that I found this morning's session very instructive, and in light of how much you learned this morning, I would advise you to keep your expectations low at lunch today. But I am a big fan of Jamie. I've watched his work. Yes, we did work together in Harvard Radcliffe students from McGovern. We did carry the state of Massachusetts. Jamie and I reconnoitered in the early 2000s when I was treasurer of the state of California, along with our common friend Felix Rohatyn, to try to make the case at that time, in a time when we had a more robust middle in American politics. We tried to make the case in the context of that recession that the federal government ought to be providing fiscal stimulus to move the economy forward instead of what ended up being a wave of speculation, real fiscal stimulus that would create jobs and wealth for this country. And as Jamie said, we connected again as Greece stood forthright and challenged the very premise of the economic policies that have kept Europe in crisis, have kept the people of Europe suffering. I was proud that I was able to lend some assistance to what I still believe was a noble effort, and one that was really just the beginning or part of an ongoing battle to change the course of economic policy across the globe. What I'd like to do today at lunch is I would like to perhaps set some of today's remarks, this morning's context, this morning's remarks and this afternoon's remarks in context, and really, in a sense, bring us back to what brought us to this dance. To talk a little bit about how we got to this state of crisis, because it's important to remember the roots of the crisis, because there is a constant effort by some to rewrite the history and to blame those who were victimized by the crisis rather than those who were the predators in the crisis. So I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how we got here, where things stand remarkably 8 years after our financial markets became visibly unraveled, even though, of course, the unraveling had begun some time before, and to talk about what must be done, and really to pick up on some of the comments this morning about what's the idea, what's the agenda, what's the political direction in which we must head to break the stranglehold that I believe that the financial system has on democracy, and to break the stranglehold of the forces of ignorance on our economic policy, which is really quite remarkable in the wake of the cataclysm that we suffered. As Jamie said, I was honored that in July of 2009, I was asked by the Congress of the United States, a very different Congress than the one today, to chair the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, was the nation's official inquiry into the causes of the nation and the global financial collapse. In the course of our investigation, and we really had three mandates. One was to examine the causes of the crisis. The second was to examine why major U.S. financial institutions collapsed or would have collapsed but for extraordinary government assistance, and also to identify for the Department of Justice where there might have been violations of law. In the course of our work, which spanned a year and a half, we reviewed millions of pages of documents that had never been seen before. We interviewed 700 witnesses. We held 19 hearings across this country. And I just want to make a personal note. I had come into this position with really a background in both the public and private sector. I had, as Jamie said, been the elected treasurer of the state of California for 8 years, but I also had been in the private sector for 2 decades, and had been a practitioner in the real economy, raising debt and equity for a variety of development projects, from large-scale renewable projects to urban infill residential developments. And I must tell you that, without getting into immediately the specifics of our findings, that my year and a half at the helm of this commission was revelatory. It was a journey of revelation, not just for me, but my other commission members. I don't think it's an understatement to say that I was shocked by what I saw. I was appalled by what I learned, and deeply disturbed about what I saw in terms of the political imbalance created by great concentrations of financial power in our country and abroad. And I say this as someone who's not a political naive. I'd been on the ballot 4 times in the state of California statewide. I'd run for governor of the state. I didn't come to this with any ivory tower illusions about what our political construct was like, but I will just tell you right now that, first of all, I was shocked at what I saw when I peered inside our financial institutions. I'd had this quaint notion, thinking of Pedro's comments of earlier today, that this was a system largely designed to create capital for wealth creation, for development, for the broadening and increasing of wealth in our society. And in fact, I saw something quite different. I felt like I had walked in the door of my local community bank, where I'd done most of my banking throughout my life, and I'd opened the wrong door, and I saw casino floors big as New York, and Las Vegas. What I saw was something inimical to the interests of economic progress in our nation and abroad. But the other thing I saw was also the enormous power of financial institutions in our country and the crudity with which they exercised their power. In the course of doing everything they could, not only to resist our investigation, but also to resist any meaningful attempts to reform the financial system after the debacle that brought not only our nation, but Europe and much of the world to its knees. So let me just start for a moment with what we found at the Commission, because it's relevant to our discussions today. And I want to start by saying that we found seminally that the cause of this crisis was not as Robert Rubin would have you believe. This was not a perfect storm. This wasn't an unfortunate coincidence of events. This was not about computer models gone awry. This was very much the result of deliberate public policy that unleashed any of the constraints of public interest on our financial institutions. It was a result of both actions and inactions, which played out over a set of decades in which financial institutions were given primacy over the control of their own affairs, and in which the governing doctrine was that these institutions would never allow themselves to be destroyed in the interest of self-preservation, and therefore that constituted protection of the public interest. Well, we know quite differently today. And if you look at the run-up to the crisis, what's really quite remarkable is the extent to which all of this was clear. The fact that there was predatory lending across this country from the late 1990s on, the fact that as early as 2004, the FBI warned of a pandemic of mortgage fraud, the fact that major financial institutions were over-levered 40-1 and even more when you count off-balance sheet exposures. There was that small matter of the use of our wealth to create $13 trillion of mortgage securities that in the end had no lasting value and washed away like sands on the beach. And of course, there was embodied at the center of this the policies of the U.S. Federal Reserve, led by Alan Greenspan, who took a very different view of what the public policy rationale ought to be in terms of making sure that the financial system was the servant, not the master of the real economy. So we found first and foremost that this was an avoidable crisis. And of course, if you look across the globe, while the financial products in Europe may have been different, the same essentially dynamic was at work in Europe and here. Financial institutions, reckless lenders, and yes, reckless borrowers run amok without any sense of the protection of the public interest or the need to focus capital in ways that built our economy in lasting ways. There were dramatic failures of supervision and regulation, and I might add that there was a lot of legal authority. No one should believe for a minute that the SEC didn't have the ability to rein in the investment banks, or that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve didn't have the ability to rein in the big money center banks like Citigroup. They did. They chose not to, despite the evidence they had. And interestingly enough, because of deregulation, they didn't act also because they didn't know what was going on, but that was by design. That was the policy decision that had been made. And of course, once the regulatory bars were down, and I might add, we had regulatory entities that were incapacitated by inadequate funding, by inadequate resources. Once those bars were down, what you saw was recklessness, failures in corporate governance at the major financial institutions that brought down our financial system and resulted in enormous costs to our taxpayers. I mean, when we think about it today, it's almost remarkable, having been through the drama of what recently happened in Greece, what it would have taken to stabilize Greece and the Eurozone and what we were willing to do for the major financial institutions here in this country. $182 billion from AIG, and in the context of their CEO making $107 million in the last 3 years he was on the job. $45 million to Merrill Lynch in the context of an institution that paid its departing CEO, Stanley O'Neill, $250 million to depart the institution. $45 billion and $300 billion of guarantees for Citigroup, again in the context of an institution that paid Robert Rubin $115 million during his tenure there. And of course, underlying all of this were massive accumulations of debt, not for good purpose, but rather for the perpetuation of the economy of speculation to which Pedro referred to earlier today. And of course, also underlying it were widespread breaches of accountability and, yes, fraud in the marketplace. Bill Blackwell, I think, will be with us here later today. But I do want to say, in looking back at this crisis, no one should minimize the wrongdoing that occurred in the financial industry to the detriment of the people of this globe. Millions of mortgages were packaged, were sold to investors. The financial institutions knew how deficient those mortgages were. Notwithstanding that, they continued to peddle them into the marketplace and affirmatively represent that those mortgages met all the standards of the lending institutions that had been displayed for the public, when in fact they knew that that was not the case. It's fair to say that what happened in the mid-2000s, leading to the collapse of 2008, was not a small bump in the road. It was a fundamental dislocation from which we are still attempting to recover. And I think, Jamie Galbraith wrote one of the best pieces on this in the Washington Monthly, in which he talked about no return to normal. After the first blush of 9 million Americans losing their jobs in a matter of months, yes, employment has stabilized some in this country, but we still have the highest rates of long-term unemployment since we started keeping records after World War II. Got the lowest ratio of wages to GDP at any time in our history. The greatest income inequality since the 1920s. Yes, 5 million households already lost their homes, but don't forget, here we are 8 years later, and in fact about 11 years later after home prices peaked in a lot of the southwest and western states, and we still have 7.4 million homeowners in this country who are underwater. About 14.4% of the homeowners in this country. We've got $1 trillion in student loan debt, largely centered on a cohort, a generation that's had the hardest time breaking into the employment markets. And of course, we see in Europe, as in the US, enormous debts in Greece and Italy and Portugal still being freighted by those countries, those people, and absolutely precluding the ability for us to lift off again. As we gather here today, to me, a couple things are particularly striking. The first is how little has changed since the collapse of 2008 in the essential architecture, ethos, and culture of the financial industry. It is more powerful today without having really undergone any kind of essential reform. And I just want to say, as we have these discussions today, that we can't undercalibrate the political imbalance that comes from enormous financial power now concentrated in this country and across this globe. There's no correlation between who paid the price and who caused the crisis. It's almost as though, and this is a Californian speaking, there was this enormous earthquake that left all the shiny, tall buildings standing and everything else in rubble. I've wondered why this is the case, and I think part of this is that in the wake of the crisis, people often focus on TARP, the bailout, the $700 billion bailout program. But in fact, what happened in this country is 24 separate programs, trillions of dollars of assistance that stabilized the financial industry and spared them of any consequences and were tied to no reforms. And of course, a version of this has happened in Europe in 2010 when the debt was taken from the banks and became part of the public realm. The banks have escaped essentially any consequence and fairly stated, I think, have played no legal, political, or economic consequence for what they have done. So therefore, 8 years later, where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves with, yes, some over-the-counter derivatives now being traded on the open exchanges and transparent, but only about 26% of the credit default swaps. And I might add the over-the-counter derivatives market is bigger today globally than it was at the start of the crisis. Large swaths of the market still dark and opaque. Compensation practices that drove much of the activity unaffected. By 2010, Wall Street compensation had fully recovered to its pre-crisis highs, and there's been no fundamental change in the structure. And I might add, shareholders have been amazingly quiet, of course hamstrung by very few rights and abilities to steer the corporations they ostensibly own. Capital is still, while it's up in the US, still lagging behind in Europe. In terms of the reform efforts, about half the rules contemplated by the Dodd-Frank reform bill are still not in place. And of course, reform in Europe and the EU continues to go at a plodding pace, again, when you consider nearly a decade has passed. One of the things that's most remarkable, though, is the concentration of just sheer money and power in the banks that are still standing. This kind of perverse result of a government bailout policy that married the weak to the ostensibly strong. And here in the U.S., we now have 79, 80% of the banking assets in this country in the top 10 banks. We have 95% of the over-the-counter derivatives activity in the top 5 banks. And I will tell you, the culture of corruption that led to mortgage fraud on a broad scale in this country played out in the securities market is unabated. Sometimes when you read the headlines, you think you're reading about the mafia. Municipal bid rigging here in this country, municipal bond bid rigging, interest rate manipulation, money laundering by major financial institutions. There was a whistleblower report in which 500 senior executives in the financial industry in the UK and the US were interviewed. And stunningly, 24% of them said that they were aware or had heard of illegal or unethical conduct in their institutions. 16% said if they could do insider trading, they would. When you boil it down there, not to be surprised, it's not surprising in the sense that there's been no consequence. One of the greatest, I think, tragedies, failures of the Obama administration is the failure to prosecute financial wrongdoing and for there to be any consequence for the enormous damage done to this economy. Now, I want to put all of this kind of slow progress in financial reform in context. It doesn't happen by mistake. It happens because Wall Street, in 2 years alone, in 2013, 2014, spent nearly $600 million on lobbying efforts, nearly $300 million on political contributions. An all-out, everyday assault on any effort to reform the system, cutting the budget of the regulators, constantly assaulting at the regulatory agencies and then in the courts any efforts to adopt new rules that would constrain the excesses in the financial industry. So I do want to say, as we meet today, there is still a very powerful financial industry that continues to dictate what ends up being economic policy and constrains in very damaging ways the practice of democracy as we always envisioned and believed. But equally stunning, I think, as the failure to fundamentally reform the financial sector is the failures of fiscal policy, or the absence of a fiscal policy in this country and in Europe, but particularly in Europe, that would drive true economic recovery, that would drive true wealth creation in the wake of this financial crisis. Now, while the U.S. response after the initial stimulus measure has been tepid, and in many respects has had some aspects of de facto fiscal austerity because of the enormous cutbacks that occurred in state and local governments in the period of 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, and which is just reversing itself now. Of course, the European response has been disastrous beyond comprehension. When you add up the imposition of the severe austerity measures in economies that are contracting, the absolute unwillingness to adjust debt to its fair market value so that it's at a sustainable level and there's fiscal room for growth, the reluctance to engage in any kind of fiscal stimulus of scale, and the Juncker plan was talked about earlier today, and even the reluctance to engage in monetary stimulus until the crisis had metastasized. What you have is, oddly enough, kind of a dark ages economic policy backed by very powerful financial forces. I want to say something about our history at Harvard. I don't know how serious a student Jamie was. I probably would have been more serious a student had I not been 17, turning 18, turning 19, discovering the world. I spent more time out of the classroom than I spent in the classroom. But I attended enough of the lectures by John Dunlap, hardly a radical, Nixon's labor secretary, to know that when economies are in crisis, you do all you can to provide the fuel for economic growth. How this has been lost is really a stunning set of events. And I do think it speaks to something that was alluded here today. In a sense, the acceptance of the rules of the game by all of us as to how the financial structure should be constructed, and the absence of a driving dream on our part to lay out a very different vision for how the financial system should work in concert with the economy. So, it's clear that our first and foremost challenge is fundamentally political, and fundamentally political in the context of very steep odds. But I will say that steep odds have never precluded people who have heart and vision for pursuing them. Anytime people talk to me about the impossibility of achievement, in the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, he also faced as great a concentration of wealth and power as we face today, faced enormous odds in implementing a reform program. So it's possible, but as of today, we haven't yet put together the politics that will make this possible. I want to make one observation about the most recent Battle of Greece. As Jamie said, I'm very proudly of Hellenic descent. And I grew up in a household in which we were raised with stories of the Greeks' heroic defense against first Mussolini and then the Germans in World War II. The willingness to fight and die for democracy. And of course, Greece at the front lines of the Western Alliance with a democratic tradition has paid an enormous price for the retention of liberty and democracy. First in repelling the Italian invasion, then fiercely resisting the German invasion, enduring a brutal occupation, coming out of the Civil War, a devastated country. So a very deep-seated belief in democracy and that as an overriding value. And while Greece was not successful, I will say that it was an important moment because little Greece was really the first country that stood up in a very measurable, clear way in front of a world audience to say that the emperor had no clothes and these economic policies were bankrupt. Now, obviously, in the end, The result has been extremely disappointing, but this should not be a call to cease the battle, but rather to find new battlegrounds with new allies with increased solidarity to carry it forward. As I think about what ought to be the principles that guide our efforts, I think there's really three thrusts. The first of those is to reform, to rein in, and to repurpose our financial system with a clear mission to be the servant, not the master, of our global economy. And this is the fundamental first step in a reinvigorated economic structure. In 1980, about 15% of our nation's corporate profits came from the financial sector. By the mid-2000s, more than 30% of the profits in our economy came from the financial sector. 1978, for every $13 in debt borrowed by financial companies, there was $100 borrowed by non-financial companies for real productivity, real wealth creation. By 2007, that had become $51 borrowed in the financial sector for every $100 borrowed in the productive sector of our economy. The amount of debt held by financial institutions in this country catapulted from $3 trillion in 1978 to $36 trillion in 2007. And of course, one of the great, I think, tragedies, as I said, of the early 2000s was the fact that we invested $13 trillion plus in mortgage securities, not in investments of lasting productivity and value for our society. So what would constitute a set of fundamental reforms in our financial institutions? The first is a commitment to justice and accountability where there's wrongdoing and excesses, the willingness to exact from financial executives a price for having committed those. And it's fundamentally important because the principles of our democracy is where there are wrongs, they need to be righted. The other principle of which we talk about today is to not just to right wrongs, but to have a justice system which people have a sense serves everyone equally. I've looked at these settlements time after time from the SEC or regulators on banks in which they pay a fine with no admission or responsibility. It makes me think of someone who robs a 7-Eleven. If that person who robbed a 7-Eleven of $1,000 was able to, within a matter of weeks, settle the charge against them for $25 and no admission of wrongdoing, would they do it again? Of course they'd do it again. So there's no real accountability, and I take hope from the new Attorney General who says that from now on we're not going to charge institutions with being felons without identifying the individuals within the institutions who committed felonies. But this is fundamental and important, and I can't imagine that we will have a constrained financial sector unless there's some belief that there's some consequence for wrongdoing. Secondly, we need to reinvigorate and accelerate the efforts in the movement for robust regulation, and that does mean corralling in the balance of the dark markets, including the derivatives that continue to be traded in secrecy. It means stronger capital standards. It's remarkable, again, here we are a decade later, and we still have a number of institutions in my mind that are fragile. It means significant constraints on risk-taking, particularly by depository institutions that have no business being in that kind of speculative work. And importantly, of course, it requires international cooperation, so there's a high road to regulatory success, not a low road that debases everyone. There need to be reforms to compensation systems, which I believe in the end can only be brought about by shareholders. Government regulatory systems are too cumbersome, but shareholders finally need to stand up, and their silence in the wake of this crisis has been remarkable. In the U.S., we need to break up the banks, and the topic of this conference is debt and democracy. And let me just say here that these institutions now in the United States, they're too big to regulate, they're too big to manage, they're too big to fail, and I think most importantly, they're too big for democracy. It's inconceivable that the regulators in this country have the power and the wherewithal and the capacity to tame these beasts as they exist today. Secondly, as we move on from reforming and repurposing the financial sector, there is the matter of debt. One of the things I think that is most remarkable, and I think the term was used today, a creditor's racket. I can't remember who used that term. It's been a creditor's racket. I've never seen anything like it in my life. The world's financial policies have been driven by protecting a set of institutions that made enormously risky loans and lost. You know, I'll submit that lending and borrowing are partners, that it takes a reckless lender and, yes, a reckless borrower. This is not to excuse the borrower. But the fact that public policy has so enormously tilted, not only in the Eurozone, but here in the U.S., to protection of lenders at all costs, has been very damaging and has prevented us from being able to adjust the levels of debt, to allocate the losses properly so we could move on in rebuilding this economy. And I just want to say that reorganization should not be a tool just for the wealthiest or for corporations. Reorganization, which has been long accepted as a way in which we crawl out of a financial abyss, needs to be something available broadly to nations and working people. And clearly, without debt restructuring, whether it's the U.S. homeowners who are working very hard just to survive, students who can't find employment in this economy, or nations like Greece or Portugal or Ireland that have enormous debt loads, it will continue to constrain any ability that we have to build the economy that we want. Finally, and most importantly, of course, we know that the most important thing we can do is turn the page on the policies of speculation and austerity that have left our economy in shambles. And to do that unabashedly, without kind of operating within the rules of what the elites might dictate is sensible economic policy, or what Paul Krugman would call very serious people, we do need to find ways politically to launch a new era of investment. Mobilizing public will, public capital, and private sector resources to build an economy of enduring and durable strength. And that means investments in education, research and development, technology, in the new green economy, defined broadly as not just renewable energy, but mass transit systems, energy efficient buildings, all those things that can create wealth as well as fight climate change. All those items together, from infrastructure to education to clean energy, that constitute the public foundation of future prosperity. We must pursue full-scale, without reservation, policies to raise wages and expand employment, including strengthening the ability of people across this world to organize on their own behalf, because in the end, that's by far the most successful way in which wages can come up. There needs to also be, interspersed in all this, as we talked about earlier today, a firm commitment in this new economy to build sustainable communities and a green economy that does confront climate change directly. And then finally, there needs to be, all as part of this, a full-scale assault on income inequality so that we can not only have a sustainable economy, but a sustainable social fabric. These are things we all know, but as we kind of get into the weeds, as we, as we follow hearings in Washington or at the SEC on any particular rule, we kind of get in the weeds in the playing field that's been constructed for us. And I do believe that now's the time to begin to construct this alternative vision and to go on offense once again 10 years after this crisis, to construct the kind of economy we need, desire, and that we want for our own nation, for the Americas, and for the Eurozone. Thank you very, very much for having me here. Questions, Jamie? All right. So, questions, discussion, yes?
I would like to ask you, how can we transform the current energy paradigm in the European Union, in the Americas, in the world, so that we can continue to have GDP growth, but not increase the human participation of the degradation of the earth.
You know, politically, this may be one of, a struggle, but policy-wise, it's not hard. I mean, the fact is that we probably need to, by the way, I should disclose, I'm on a board, I've been for a long time. There's an organization which Damon knows well called the Blue-Green Alliance, which is an organization which is a coalition between major U.S. environmental groups, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund, and major industrial unions in this country. The fact is that we need to make the transition to fully renewable clean energy in the next 30 years. We really don't have a choice. The planet's burning up if no one's noticed. And we don't have a choice in it, but it's accomplishable. My own state set a goal of having 20% renewables, which meaning that we get 20% of our electric power from renewables by 2010, 33% by 2020. We've met that goal essentially. And I might add, just as a side note, I've ended up co-developing 3 projects of about 250 megawatts to supply about 100,000 homes. And the Governor Brown just signed a bill to increase our renewable portfolio standard to 50% by 2030. It's achievable. The technology's there. The pricing is there. One interesting thing that's happening right now is that those of us who are in that business relied for a long time on 2 phenomena to drive the production of renewable energy. One was the investment tax credit, which is 30% for renewables versus the normal investment tax credit in the U.S. of 10%. The other thing that has driven this industry has been these renewable portfolio standards that have had the investor-owned utilities mandated to buy renewable power. But with the reduced cost now of solar technology, what we're finding is we can compete straight up. And if you talk to people in the industry 2-3 years ago, they were, I think this is a technical term, freaked out about the loss of the 30% investment tax credit, less so today. And so we can get there. And by the way, the ways to get there are production of renewable energy, taking the built environment and dramatically increasing energy efficiency, which are all non-exportable jobs. It is very doable from a technical standpoint. The question is whether we're going to have the political will to make the conversion fast enough. Yes?
How would you account for the relative lack of attention to, let alone response to, your report?
Well, it's a good question. So first of all, just to be blunt about it, one thing we realized fairly early on is the Republicans didn't appoint commissioners to help us achieve a national goal here. They were sent to undermine our work. I mean, and I could take a whole other lunch talking about the story of trying to do a full-scale look at what happened. So we committed ourselves to the following goal, that we knew there would be intensive efforts to rewrite the history of the crisis, what brought it on, and therefore we decided that we would write a history for the ages, a definitive history, so that at least the truth would always be there. And that's an important commodity in politics, even though it's not always definitive or determinative, as we know. So that's the determination we made. And I will say one thing, for all the kind of attacks I've gotten, others have gotten, no one's ever said there's this error or there's this error. The report has been immaculate in terms of standing up to immense scrutiny by forces who had a lot of resources to, look through every nook and cranny for anything that was, less than accurate. Here's really, I think, the response. We finished our report in February of 2011. It was right after the November 2010 elections. And a very odd thing happened. In the wake of this enormous calamity, the people of this country returned to power in Congress, the very party that had been the lead but not the sole participant in the full-scale deregulation of the financial industry and of the tearing down of all the barriers to public protection. In my personal view, it was because in the depth of the crisis, they did not see on the left a driving dream of what would be done to bring the country back and help working people. In my view, it was their anger was such that they wanted change, and they didn't see that in us. And I say us meaning the Democrats. And that we lost that moment, I think, is still a very extraordinarily difficult thing. We lost the moment. Can we get it back? Yeah, but those were the circumstances in which our best opportunity existed. On that hopeful note, do you have a question?
Yeah. So one of the things that always struck me about the FCIC is that Congress and the Democrats appointed a commission to discover the causes of the crisis, and the report was scheduled to come out after they passed the legislation fixing what happened. What does that say? How do you interpret that?
There's something called politics. I mean, no, I mean, so here's my view. Well, but I'm not being flip. They felt an urgent need to act. The logical process would have been full-scale investigation, building essentially the case for reform, and then enacting reform. And, it didn't happen. Now, from my perspective, I was in the position of saying, okay, that's happening, but this is still an exercise of enormous value and import to the country. So, yeah, would the logical way have been done this to do the investigation, build the support, move? Yeah, having said that, given what I just talked about was that loss of opportunity in 2010, if they'd waited, maybe nothing would have happened. So it was a political dynamic, pure and simple. Yes?
You said a little bit about business, financial sector, political elite, but I took a look into your CV and I'm not at all surprised that you were not elected for governor.
Thank you.
With your values, with your axiology, with your views, you are unelectable. Because political mechanism works in such a way that people do elect the ones who don't want to make the changes. You are in favor. Because this is not about conflict of ideas only, or first of all, this is about the conflict of interests.
Yes.
And what you are saying is music to my ears. Feel already to be invited to Poland and to repeat this great speech, to teach this elites a little bit what's going on. But you didn't use the word media. I can't see any chance for the solution. You 1, 2, 3, 4, everything has been said already. Without even lecturing, like distinguished professors, send your students or your friends, to see Wall Street 2, the inside the job, or to read the book by Susskind, The Confidence Man, and you have the answer. And you gave us the answer how it works. But our observation from Europe, from elsewhere, it is that it would be impossible without manipulation of the public mood by the media, which are a part of this game. I can't see any chance for change for better without a proper attitude, commitment to the values you are stressing, without engagement of the media. How to approach this challenge? To have the media on the right side of the conflict in which we are contemporary in the world for us involved. Thank you.
Well, let me take actually the first part of this, because there are moments, though, when people are receptive to a message which counters very powerful forces. I mean, there are. And they tend to be when people are struggling and they're looking, they're willing to take the risk of change. And I guess what I was saying is that manifested itself in 2008 and could have manifested itself in 2010, but didn't. There was an opportunity lost. Not to relive my own election, but it was 2006, and as you remember, even though the economy was crumbling, the House looked pretty good at the time, 2006. It was like 1928. The party was still going. And in that circumstance, you're right, there's very little chance that a message of fundamental change is going to prevail. But I take the view that there's been many times in our country's history when very powerful forces have been aligned against change, when in fact, if you have a set of enduring ideals and you stay at them and you wait for your right opportunity, you can achieve the success. And like I said, it should have been a combination of 2008, 2010. I think one, not to overanalyze it, my father, who is now 93, pointed out that the Democrats in 1932 and 1934 had the great advantage by the time the 32 election came along, that the evidence was clear as to who were the perpetrators of the problem, and that was somewhat unclear to Americans, even though it shouldn't have been, since Obama came into office, right as the economy was collapsing. But there are moments of opportunity. On the question of the media, by the way, just as a candidate, I don't whine or complain about it, but it is quite remarkable when you're in a race like that to see how financial interests really line up. They get where they got to be. When I ran for governor, they put in millions on the other side. I mean, I was actually a good fundraiser. We were dwarfed in the end. My opponents combined spent about $160 million to 70-some, plus they had a global actor or whatever he is, as their standard bearer, whatever he is. As to the question of the media, that's a much more difficult question because, I saw it in California. They're owned by corporate entities, pure and simple. If you're going to then try to compete on the playing field of purchased time, of course, money forces will always have more than those who aren't moneyed. I don't have a silver bullet for that, but you're right. It's an enormous challenge, even though the democratization of information sources is nothing probably but good for us in that respect. Thank you.